Hey all you heroes and champions, crows, pirates, and inquisitors. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast. I'm Shelby.
And I'm Austin.
And we are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe. From the Maker to Lyrium to Aravels, we will cover it all. There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hey, Shelby.
Hey, Austin.
You ready to talk about some Dragon Age?
I'm ready. Like SpongeBob.
All right. Well, there's some good news and there's some bad news.
Are
you ready?
Okay, yeah, I'm ready.
Which one do you want first?
Let's go with the bad news.
Okay. The bad news is we're at the end of our Countries of Thedas series.
No, we have one more.
We do? Oh, yeah. I forget because it's very small. The bad news is we're almost at the end of our Countries of Thedas series.
Okay, what's the good news?
The good news is that we are talking probably about a very favorite and very not a lot known country of Thedas.
We are, and I'm not sure if we can call this a country.
Oh, interesting. Our catchphrase. Interesting.
That is our catchphrase.
What are we talking about?
Well, today we're talking about Par Vollen and Seheron, both of which are occupied by the Qunari.
Mm-hmm. So are these two cities?
No, Par Vollen, well, they're both in... It's kind of confusing because we honestly don't know everything about these two places, but Par Vollen and Seheron are basically countries. Seheron is an island. I kind of picture it like the size of England. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's how I picture it. And then Par Vollen is the homeland, really, of the Qunari. Par Vollen is located north of Ravane. The Qunari are not the first to inhabit this island or even the only ones to have ever claimed it, which we'll get into. But it's where they live now, and it's really now it is Qunari, like that's just what it is. So I hope that's an answer to your question.
Yes, that makes sense. All right. Well, I guess let's just dive in. You kind of already got started on Par Vollen, the homeland of the Qunari.
Yes, a little bit. It said it's located north of Ravane, and before the Qunari arrived in Par Vollen, I'm digging into the ancient history a little bit, but before the Qunari arrived, there was a race there, and this group of people were called the Fex. We really know nothing about them. We just know that they existed and basically integrated into the Qunari. So maybe we'll get more of that in the future, but we'll see.
What I was going to say, just like as a disclaimer before this, for those of you who maybe not have delved deeply into the Qunari lore in Inquisition and Dragon Age 2, but Qunari, their names are their positions in society.
Right, like their names are not actual names that are unique to each and every individual. There is no individual in the Qunari.
Right, there is only the Qun. And so we're going to be saying names like Sten and Arashok and Assad. Like, these are all positions, but they're also individuals. Iron Bull is really kind of the first member of the Qun that has like a distinct personality.
Well, not a distinct personality.
Well, I guess
Yeah. I mean, they each have their own personalities, I think, because they are individuals, even if they don't recognize that part of themselves. So they each have things that make them unique. But they don't have, like, that part of them is not prominent like it may be in Orlais or Ferelden.
Right. And so, just so that when we say Sten, we are not necessarily talking about Sten, the Dragon Age Origins companion.
Right, but I think what we're going to try to do in this episode is differentiate when we are talking about the specific characters versus the titles. And I do think this will only be a little bit confusing when we're talking about the Arishok and like what makes up Qunari society. So, but either way, we'll try to differentiate which we mean.
Right. All right, well, let's keep going then. Just wanted that little disclaimer out of the way.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the capital of Par Vollen is Qunandar, and the language that they speak in Par Vollen is Qunlat. So everything kind of revolves around the Qun. So let's dig into the ancient history a little bit. And in a lot of our past episodes, we have started with like the ancient age or the divine age or whatever, like especially in these last two episodes we just did with the dwarves, like we're starting way before in many of the humans are even on Thedas. So we're talking a long time ago. In this, we are not. So when I say ancient history, it's really not ancient history as the rest of Thedas knows it. So, but this is ancient history for the Qunari on Thedas. So, starting out, before the Qunari came into power, Tevinter held a pretty loose grasp in control of Par Vollen. And pretty much as soon as the Qunari landed, they started to conquer Par Vollen and took it away from Tevinter. And this happened in 630 steel. So this is just 300 years before the events of Dragon Age Origins.
So by the time of Origins, the Qunari are still kind of a relatively new player in the game.
Yeah, I mean, compared to everyone else, absolutely. But hear me when I say that new is not, weak or anything like that. I mean, they're extremely powerful, as we've seen throughout the games even. So yeah, they are the newest players, but they are not the weakest players by any stretch.
Right. It makes me wonder where the Qunari came from originally.
Yeah. That's a great question that we just don't know the answers to. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. So when they first landed in Par Vollen, there were some people that lived on the island, but they either, were executed, they fled, or they converted to the Qun. And pretty much immediately after they landed and conquered on Par Vollen, the Qunari went to war with the rest of Thedas, wanting to conquer, wanting to convert everyone to the Qun. So, I mentioned the Fex earlier. We know virtually nothing about them. They now have assimilated completely into Qunari culture. And one of the reasons why we know so little about the Fex and just generally about Par Vollen is because very few outsiders are ever permitted to visit Par Vollen. We, as the player, the only things we've learned about Par Vollen are through the lens of the Iron Bull, Sten, or the Arishok. And maybe a few random Codex entries, but the bulk of what we know comes from those three characters. So, throughout this episode, we will tell you as much as we can about Par Vollen and Seheron, but we'll also focus on the Qunari society especially since the society is really inseparable from the cities and the culture of Par Vollen and the Qunari.
All right.
So, to start it off, the World of Thedas Encyclopedia claims that Par Vollen is the only place to understand the whole of Qunari society because you can see it in its entirety. The Qunari view their society as a single creature, a living entity whose health and well-being is the responsibility of everyone. Most of the Qunari outside of Par Vollen belong to the army, the physical body. The mind and the soul of the Qunari, they stay in Par Vollen. So from our perspective, from the player's perspective, we have seen a very, very, very limited chunk of who the Qunari actually are.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I know. And I really didn't realize how deep this went until I started getting into this research. And like, you can do this too if you're listening. Like, you can just go to the Dragon Age Wiki right now. And we're about to start talking about the 3 branches of Qunari society. And you can plug each one of these 3 branches into the Dragon Age Wiki. And you can just look at the length of the article, and you can see just the difference in amount of knowledge from that. Like the Arishok and the military articles are really long. Like, we've got a lot of good info about that. But the other 2 are maybe 2 paragraphs. And that's pretty significant. It really shows you how little we know. But we'll tell you what we do know. So, starting off, we wanted to talk about Qunari society because of this quote from the encyclopedia that I just read, that Par Vollen's the only place to understand it. We thought we would paint a picture as best we can of what we know about the whole of Qunari society. So, to start out, and this is probably one of the most important things to know about Qunari society. There are 3 branches of society in Par Vollen generally. And that is known as the triumvirate. So there's these 3 branches. There's the army, and then there is the priesthood, and then there is the crafters and the merchants. So those are the 3 main branches, and I'll dive into each of those a little bit. But those 3 together are known as the triumvirate, and they're like a trinity, and they are inseparable from who the Qunari actually are. And each person, each individual Qunari is placed under one of those 3 branches, and that's their job. That's what they do. That's their life. And you can really talk to Iron Bull in Dragon Age Inquisition about some of this stuff, and he'll give you his perspective.
All right. Well, are you ready to just get a little bit more into these branches?
I guess so. It was kind of confusing doing this research because so the first branch is the Antom, and the Antom are led by the Arishok. Well, we know the most about this one, of course, and the other 2, I don't know if their leader and the name of the branch are the same, or we just don't know the name of that branch. So that was a little confusing, but let's dig into the Antom a little bit. So the Antom, which means body in the Qunari language, in Kunlat, they are the military branch, and they're the soldiers. So the Arishok is the commander of the Antom. And when I say the Arishok, I am referring to the position, the title of the Arishok. We meet the Arishok of that time period in Dragon Age 2 in Kirkwall. But since, as we know, we have all played the game, hopefully, Hawk takes out the Arishok, and so they have to appoint a new Arishok. So the Arishok is not always the same person. But right now I'm talking about the leader, not the individual. So the Qunari see the Antom as the eyes, ears, legs, arms, and hands of the Qunari. And that is a direct quote from Mary Kirby. She is a writer for Dragon Age. So that quote tells us they are the ones that are doing the outreaching. They are the ones that are going and they're seeing and they're pushing or they're pulling or they're conquering. They're the ones that are doing all of the things outward, outside of Par Vollen, outside of Qunari society. So, because of this, most of, or at least a significant chunk of the Qunari that we meet throughout Thedas belong to the Antom, or at least part of this group in some way or another. So I'm thinking of the Arishok, Sten, they belong to the Antom. And of course, Iron Bull, the other Qunari main character that we know, he actually doesn't belong to the Antom because he is part of the Ben-Hassrath. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. So, what does the Antom even do? Well, they, of course, make up the military and they gather military intelligence and all that kind of stuff. But they also seek out and destroy enemies of the Qunari. They conquer anyone who's considered to be a menace to Qunari society. I'm thinking specifically of Isabella. And they protect and recover Qunari artifacts and technology. Again, as we see in both Dragon Age 2 with Isabella and in Dragon Age Inquisition in Trespasser.
Mm-hmm. With the
Dragon's Breath Conspiracy. Absolutely, yes. And we'll talk about that later too. So, because the Antom is the group that reaches out beyond the Qunari, like I just said, the Antom are the spokespeople of the Qun. This does not mean that the Antom are the top of the Qun. That's not what it means. The three branches are a trinity. So if you have any experience like with church or Christianity at all, the language of the Trinity might be a little bit familiar to you because in Christian churches, the Trinity is a big deal. And that's how Christians view God. And so it's kind of the same. There are three branches that come together and make one branch, still keeping their distinctions, right? But they're all one. And it means that none of the one branches are more important or higher than another. They all are equal with their own role and making their own impact in the world, but they all come together as one.
It's continue with the Christian metaphor, it's one body but many parts.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to me with the Antom, because this is the real, the Qunari are really the first group in Thedas that is kind of seeking conversion to their beliefs.
Yeah, you're right. Because the Chantry really doesn't want that.
No, it's more of if you are of the Chantry, stay the Chantry. And we welcome anyone who wants to walk in the light of the Maker, but they don't really care about
conversion.
They don't care about spreading the word of Andraste necessarily as much as they care about protecting the integrity of the institution.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, it's different.
And I think it's interesting. And another thing is the Qunari, the Qun is really the first, and it kind of falls into that weird thing. It's it is a religion, but it's also not a religion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, but they take, it doesn't matter what race you are, you can convert to the Qun.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Chantry really focuses on humans and elves, and mainly just city elves, not really the Dalish.
Right.
And obviously, following uh, the Dalish gods, the elven gods is for the elves.
Right.
And then and the dwarves don't really care about teaching you to worship the stone.
Right. That's true too.
Um, but the Qunari are like, yeah, you want to convert. It's like, it's a little aggressive because it's convert to the Q
Or die. It's so Spanish Inquisition to me.
Right, and like the Arishakin too is basically like saying like you are like a wretched thing of Kirkwall is wretched, and so it must be cleansed,
Right.
and conquered, convert to the Qun or die, and so it's just an interesting point of like such assurance that their way is the righteous way, not just the right way, but the righteous way, the way to be good.
Mm-hmm.
It's a conviction we haven't really seen in Dragon Age outside of the Qunari.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point, and I think that's something that we need to remember as we go through this episode and even into Dragon Age 4. All right, so the last thing I have to say about the Antom is that the Arishok, like I said earlier, is the leader, but he is not the top leader of the Qunari that, they share. And the Arishok is always a man. He's always a male. And females can technically be part of the Antom, but if they do, they're basically like referred to as men. And you see this in Origins with Sten, and he basically is like, if you play a female hero of Ferelden, you have a conversation with Sten where he's basically like, are you a woman? And you're like, what the heck is happening? And right. He's like, why are you a warrior if you're a woman? Do you not want to be a woman? And you basically have the option to be like, you can be a warrior and a woman. What are you talking about? And then he finally explains a little bit like, well, that's not how it works in the Qun. So.
Right. And then I guess another thing is like in Trespasser, we meet another leader.
Yes.
Of a faction of the Qunari. Right?
No.
Oh.
Well, I mean, a leader, yes, but not a leader of one of the three branches.
Right. But she is some commander of the Ben-Hassrath.
We'll get there.
Yeah. All right.
All right, you ready to hear about the second branch?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, this one's short because we know virtually nothing. The second branch is the Aragana, and the Aragana are the mind of the Qunari. And so they are the crafters and the merchants, and so they are led by the Aragana, same name, unlike the previous Antom and Arishok. The Aragana is always female, also unlike the Antom. She oversees all of the basic systems of Qunari society. So again, this is an important role. She oversees all of the craftspeople. She oversees the merchants. She oversees agriculture and industry and all of that kind of stuff. So now that I've kind of told you about these two leaders, you can really see what I'm talking about when I say that the Antom are the ones that reach out. Like the Arishok literally gets stationed in Kirkwall for how many years? Several years. And the Aragana is overseeing the infrastructure and the farming and all of this stuff that's so integral to life on Par Vollen. So she would never get stationed somewhere outside of Par Vollen.
Right. because she can't do her job outside.
Exactly. And the Arishok, most of his job is going to be outside of Par Vollen, if we're going to be really honest about it. So moving on a little bit to the Arakun, this is one we know a little bit more about than the Aragena, at least. The Arakun is the soul of the Qunari. They are the priesthood. The Arakun is led by the Arakun, which can be male or female. So the Arakun commands both the Ben-Hassrath and the Temasrens, if I can say that right. So we know quite a bit about the Ben-Hassrath because Iron Bull is a Ben-Hassrath. So they can be either men or women. They have several different jobs. Iron Bull refers to them as spies, but they're also religious law enforcers and re-educators. So they both re-educate the unruly Qunari and new converts. So those are kind of the different jobs that they do. And like I said, Iron Bull is part of the Ben-Hassrath, but depending on your decisions in Inquisition, that could change. And then Iron Bull also tells us, I think Iron Bull is the first place we learn about the Temasrens, but I could be wrong.
Yes, you are.
Okay, so the Temasrens are the ones who control the Qunari's breeding program, basically, however you want to phrase it. They don't have the nuclear family of a mom and a dad and 2 kids. Like, they do not have that. They don't have anything resembling that. They instead pair people up, I guess, to have children. And the Temasrens raise all the children and assign all of the roles. So they're really important because if you make an enemy of a Temasren, she could give you a really crappy job for the rest of your life. So they have a huge amount of influence.
It makes sense about like the raising of the family in that because like there is no individual under the Qun.
Right.
You are a part of the Qun. You are a part of this one entity. So children are raised as part of the one entity. There is no individual family unit because you all are the family unit.
Right, exactly. So I just want to close out this little section about the Triumvirate with a quote from the Arishok of Dragon Age 2. He says this: Arishok, Aragena, Arakun, pillars of the Qunari, of the nation that must be. I think it really illustrates, again, what we were talking about, like that instinct toward conversion and conquering. Like, they see themselves as an inevitability. They're going to exist. They're the right thing. They're the righteous thing. They're what's supposed to happen. And so they have to conquer everything else.
It's like that's their prerogative. Like that if they don't attempt to conquer everything else, they're failing in their duty.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, before we move on, I just have one last thing about Par Vollen, and I feel like this has been really short. But we don't have a lot of information. So the last thing I have to say about Par Vollen is that the ancient inhabitants of Par Vollen built these huge pyramids. And the pyramids depict images and murals of the original natives to the island interacting in a subservient way with horned beings who are not Qunari. I'm just going to repeat that. The pyramids have murals and depictions of the natives of Par Vollen interacting in a subservient way with beings that are horned but are not Qunari. So a lot of people believe that the Qunari conquered Par Vollen so easily because the natives associated the Qunari with the horned beings from the past. And therefore, they chose to submit to the Qunari instead of fighting or resisting in whatever way. And all of that text comes from a codex called the Pyramids of Par Vollen.
Yeah, that's really interesting because and maybe we can get into this later, but there is this, theory, or I think Iron Bull talks about this, that Qunari contain dragon blood.
Yes.
And that's what gives them their size, their horns, all of these things.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't find that online anywhere. I couldn't find that in any of my classic resources that I go to. But
I believe it's in a conversation you have with Iron Bull after he is present for you killing a dragon.
I thought it was if you become a reaver.
No, he does have something to say if you become a reaver, but anyone can have the dragon conversation.
Okay.
Because you basically go to him and he's like, hey, let's have a drink and toast to our dragon killing. And that's when he tells you, like, the Qunari's, like, respect for a dragon, right, and, like, the honor that comes from defeating something so great and powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where he tells you that.
Well, I'll have to figure that out.
Right, maybe that... I find it highly unlikely that the Qunari just happen to land in an island that happens to venerate horned individuals.
Mm-hmm. Too much of a coincidence for you.
Right, and so maybe in some time, like, way ancient age, because we only have recorded history from the dwarfs, the elves, and not really the elves, and Tevinter from the ancient age. Well, in the tribes of Syrian and Alamar.
Yeah.
And so we don't really know what's going on in those lands before that.
Yeah, there's a lot of unexplored history.
And it's like it would be kind of like colonial of us to assume that nothing is going on there.
Absolutely. I don't want to make that assumption.
Right. And so there's obviously, like, the Vex are living there, and there's these things. So maybe way back in the Qunari's history and way back in the Vex history, there was a point of tension. And so, like, the Qunari happened to sail there because in their tradition, they know this is a land that they can sail to.
It's very plausible. I do just want to say it's the Fex, like fox, but that's okay. No big deal. Well, sorry. It's okay. I think it's time for a break.
I think you are right. All right. Let's take a break. All right. Welcome to the middle of our show where we tell you what's going on with the podcast. As always, our Patreon is available. You can find the link in our episode description. You can also come and hang out with us on the Robots Radio Discord. That link is also found in the episode description. If you'd like to support the podcast in a way that's not financial, you can always go to Apple and leave us a review. If you like what we do, leave us a 5-star review, leave us some kind words, and we will read that review on the podcast. And you'll hear that. So please review and support us that way. I want to say that I have not forgotten about my streaming of the Dragon Age playthrough that I've been doing. We've just had a lot going on with the upcoming holidays and my own personal work stuff that I haven't been able to get to it. And Shelby has played through the Mass Effect series for the first time.
Yeah.
So I've been helping her with that too.
I've been crying a lot.
But I'm going to get back to that streaming of that, and we can find out what happens with my Inquisitor, Llewellyn, and the decisions that she makes. Yeah. All right. You ready to get back into it?
I am.
All right. So, that's enough, I think, about Par Vollen, or maybe that's all we really have about Par Vollen.
Yeah.
So there is, I've always been confused of that, because in interactions, like, both in with the Arishok and Sten and Iron Bull, there's conversations about Seheron and Par Vollen, and I always thought it was like, oh, Seheron is like this small city that's within Par Vollen. No, that is not the case.
No, it is not. So Seheron is the largest island in Thedas. So it's a pretty sizable island, and the Qunari control it right now.
And I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is that so much of, I always thought Seheron was a more like, just like, capital of Par Vollen maybe, or something like that, even though that's not the case, because of, it is brought up often, like, when Dorian talks about the Qunari, he talks about Seheron.
Yeah, and that makes sense if you think about the geography. It's sense. Yeah.
So let's get into this.
Yeah, so Seheron is close to Tevinter. It's on like the east side, I think is the right direction. Yes, east of Tevinter. So it's not like right off the coast, but it is way closer to Tevinter than Par Vollen is. So, like I just said, Seheron is the largest island in Thedas. It is basically a jungle, and it's northeast of Tevinter. So historically, the island did belong to Tevinter, and they ruled it for a long time, but it was claimed by the Qunari in 632 Steel, which is pretty significant because that's only 2 years after the Qunari land on Thedas. So after about 10 years, the Qunari have taken control of the island and a significant portion of Tevinter's mainland too. Tevinter, in response, has declared multiple exalted marches against the Qunari and have been unsuccessful, as the Qunari still hold Seheron. So in the events leading up to Dragon Age, the games, Tevinter had basically pushed the Qunari out of most of the mainland. So the Qunari held on to Par Vollen and Seheron. But in the timeline of the games, the Qunari have pushed their way into the Tevinter mainland. Again, taking some cities like Ventus and Nerominion and some of these other more minor cities, the Qunari have taken back from Tevinter yet again. And this is kind of like an ongoing push and pull between the two. So they're just kind of in that eternal struggle with one another. But back to Seheron a little bit. Seheron, the island, is considered to be Kabathari to the Qun, which means a land to be conquered and converted. Literally, those who need to be taught. So I would assume that all of Thedas is Kabathari, but because Seheron is technically under their rule, that's where they're focused the most in my reading of this. I could be wrong. The devs can come and correct me, but that's my reading. That's my take.
Well, I think the Arishok might use that word when talking about Kirkwall.
Okay, maybe. I don't remember.
I don't quote me on that. It's been a while since I've had those conversations, and I haven't pressed X through them. So
yeah,
don't quote me on that.
Well, so it's considered, people who need to be taught. But to add to this, the Qunari control over Seheron is not the same as Par Vollen. Like, Par Vollen is theirs. Like, it's theirs. Seheron, they maintain a loose control over. It is wild. It's chaotic. It's not this orderly systematic society that they've created in Par Vollen. It's way more chaotic than that, because they meet a heavy resistance from Tevinter. They meet a heavy resistance from Tal-Vashoth in the north part of the island, and they meet a heavy resistance from the Fog Warriors. Now, we first hear about the Fog Warriors, I think, in Dragon Age 2 with Fenris, which, Austin, you're doing your little happy dance right now, I'm sure. But, so the Fog Warren... the Fog Warrens. I've been playing way too much Mass Effect. Anyways, so the Fog Warriors are native Seheron rebels who have resorted to guerrilla warfare against both Qunari and Tevinter occupants. So they are known as the Fog Warriors, and tales of their prowess and stealth have given them a major reputation on the island and on the mainland. So they are very feared warriors, well respected, very much seen as a threat. So the Qunari do not take their occupation of Seheron for granted. They know that it could change. And so because of that, I think is the reason why they've been able to hold on to it. Whereas Tevinter, in so many ways, they take their lands for granted. They take their power for granted. They think, well, we're Tevinter. Nobody could make us fail. Nobody could get underneath us. Nobody could conquer us. But the Qunari, they think, well, yeah, they could. And so we're going to be ready. And I think that's a huge difference in attitude.
Right. Definitely.
Okay, so let's get back to your favorite character for a minute. So, just before the events of the Fifth Blight and the events of Origins, Sten lived in Seheron. And Fenris says that he has been told he's from Seheron, but he doesn't remember due to the amnesia caused by the application of his lyrium markings. Right. And, in addition, the Ben-Hassrath recommend a 2-year maximum tour of service on Seheron. Iron Bull served on Seheron for almost 10 years. So, literally 5 times the recommended maximum amount.
And I think Bull talks about, he also talks about fighting the Fog Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that it's kind of like a moment of okay, if you can fit the Ben-Hassrath, if you can survive Seheron, you can come work for us.
Well, he was in the Ben-Hassrath. He got sent to
Right.
Seheron. So he was already working for them.
But it's like a rite of passage. It's like your initiation almost, or you're pledging.
You haven't been to Seheron yet? You're not a real Ben-Hassrath.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see that. Well, the only other thing I have left is there are 2 notable cities in Seheron. One is called Alam, and the other is Seheron, the capital.
Well, that's Seheron. Okay. So, we would be remiss to talk about, because we've kind of talked about it with every other country. So, what's going on in Par Vollen and Seheron after, what do we know after the events of Dragon Age Inquisition? What's going on?
Well, there's not much that we know. If you've read Tevinter Nights, you will know, and I did not do a ton of research about this, so this is just a little bit of a summary. But if you've read Tevinter Nights, you'll know that there's a conflict in the Triumvirate. And what I mean by that is that the Antom has basically broken off from the Aragena and the Arakune. And they're kind of doing their own thing.
And, we never said this. This is a very important detail. The current Arishok of the Antom is Sten, who is no longer Sten. He is Arishok.
Right. Right. And we find that out in the comics.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't know, when I say that the Antom has broken off, to be fair, it's a little ambiguous. I don't think it's the entire Antom, or at least I don't know if it's the entire Antom or just a group of it. But when you read Tevinter Nights, and I don't want to get too spoilery for that book because it's new still, you know, it hasn't even been out for a year. But yeah, so there's some conflict in the Triumvirate, and I definitely think it will play into future installments of Dragon Age, whatever they may be, video games, books, comics, whatever.
So, just kind of like, you can probably give a quick thing, like, is the conflict that's in there, is it about how things have been handled in the past recent 10 years? Like, what is the driving force of this civil war?
That's a good question. I can't totally remember because it's been a long time since I've read the book. But from my memory, correct, if I'm remembering correctly, it's more like this group that splinters off wants to be more vengeful and more proactive in conquering than they have been.
Right. And I would assume that, like, based on conversations that we can have with Varric when you ask about what happened to the Arishok from DA2, he talks about kind of like, you know, the Qun in Par Vollen quickly basically disowned the Arishok's actions of DA2.
Yeah.
To say that, like, he wasn't working for us. And so, and he says, like, they were trying to avoid another exalted march. So it's an idea. It sounds like to me from that there's leadership within the Triumvirate that do not want a long drawn out conflict with the rest of Thedas, particularly with Orlais they're in conflict with Tevinter, but they don't want to bring Orlais into this conflict.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you have to remember, we didn't talk about this because I didn't think it through. But the rest of Thedas, other than Tevinter, they basically have like a treaty of peace with the Qunari. Like, there were a crap ton of exalted marches, separate from Tevinter's exalted marches. So they had, you know, like a lot of wars in those middle ages. But technically, the Dragon's Breath conspiracy, which we're fixing to talk about, that could be seen as an act of war on the rest of Thedas, and therefore a breach of that treaty. So,
right, which is why the actions of the Arishok in DA2 would be like denounced by the Triumvirate,
right?
Because Kirkwall has a history of invasion and conquering with the Qunari, which we learned in our Free Marches episode.
Yes. All right.
Well, let's get into our side character, which answers my question from earlier.
It does. So our side character for today is Viddasala. And if you've played Trespasser recently, you'll know Viddasala very well. We meet her in that DLC of Inquisition Trespasser. And she is a co-leader of the Ben-Hassrath. There are 3 co-leaders of the Ben-Hassrath. This is kind of imitating the Triumvirate, right? She's also a high-ranking agent of the priesthood, not just the Ben-Hassrath, of the Era Qun. Right. So she's also the first female Qunari major character that we meet, excepting, of course, a female Inquisitor that's Qunari. And I can't tell you a lot about her personality and who she is as a person, like where she grew up or anything like that, because that's not something we learn about Qunari. So I'm just going to tell you what we know about her. And this might be a little bit shorter than our other ones, but we'll make it work. So the Viddasala specializes in finding studying, researching, analyzing, and eradicating magic. She also handles the conversion of foreigners and the re-education of Qunari dissidents. She sees the world as drowned by the chaotic dangers of magic. And so she does whatever's necessary to stop magic, no matter the cost. So the Viddasala Inquisition oversees the Dragon's Breath conspiracy. And this was a plot to kill like all of the leaders of southern Thedas. So that Orlais and Ferelden would be vulnerable to Qunari occupation. And if you don't quite remember what the Dragon's Breath conspiracy is, it is basically a plot that happens it's the major thing that leads to the end of Trespasser. But basically you're at the, what is it called?
Exalted Council?
Yes, thanks. So basically you're at the Exalted Council and you find a dead Qunari body. Just there. Don't know why. Don't know how. Don't know where it came from. So, of course, as the Inquisitor, you have to go investigate. And this leads you to uncover this plot where the Viddasala and her cronies have basically enslaved this dragon so that they can produce Gatlock, which is an explosive like dynamite, and they're trying to take down the Inquisition because she sees the Inquisition as a supporter of the ancient magic god Finharel. And in conversations with her in the final, leading to the final confrontation, the Inquisitor is basically like, look, I'm not associated with Finharel. Like, I don't have an agent of Finharel. What are you talking about? And Viddasala basically realizes that, oh, the Inquisitor doesn't know about Soulless. And so then that leads us into the final scenes of the game where Viddasala basically proclaims that the Inquisitor's soul is dust. And so she flees through an alluvion with a group of Qunari. Her personal Saarebas, which is a mage in Qunari, his name is Seraph, then attacks the Inquisition's party. After defeating Seraph, the party flees through that same alluvion where we then meet Soulless. Most of us, I think, while playing, we are just totally focused on Soulless because he's disappeared. For those of us who romanced him as Soulless-mancers, we're totally focused on him. We're reunited, whatever. Well, Viddasala was confronting Soulless just as we were fleeing, as we were coming through the alluvion. And we hear that, you can hear them. And Soulless says that Viddasala should just leave, don't trouble him anymore. But instead of leaving, she turns to attack Soulless. And before she can really move, Soulless petrifies her with a single thought.
It's interesting to me that, the real thing that sticks out to me about this character, other than that, being the first female Qunari person that we meet, is her role in, kind of eradicating magic.
Mm-hmm.
And, the hatred and, I want to say fear that she associates with Finharel.
Yes. Yes, I want to know how the Qunari even know about Finharel.
Right. And so So, for those of you who don't know, there is a very popular fan theory that you could research that talks about talking about connection between the old gods of Tevinter, the Evanuris, and the dragons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that the because we see the only real, like, manifestation that we meet of the elven gods is Flemeth, Mythal, and Solus. What can Flemeth turn into that we've never seen any other creature do? She can turn into a dragon.
Yeah, but so can Morrigan.
And so can Morrigan. Which begs some interesting parallels there about what that does. I do think it's interesting that more so in Dragon Age 2, Flemeth's dragon looks very much like the archdemon from Dragon Age Origins.
I've never noticed that before.
Right. And so it kind of lends the idea of what if the old gods and the forgotten ones are the same.
Yeah, I definitely see that one a little bit more than the old gods and the Ebenuris.
And there's an idea of, there's a strong relationship between the old gods and dragons. They're all dragons.
Mm-hmm.
They can all be worshipped as dragons. And there's a connection to dragons, we think, with this and the Ebenuris. And at least maybe the forgotten ones. And the Qunari say that they are descendants of, dragons or whatever. And so maybe they fear Fen'Harel because of this, inheritance of, like, dragons and everything. And, like, the dragons we meet in the games are not what I would call, like, sentient dragons.
Mm-hmm. They're not D&D dragons.
Like, right, but, like, in most other fantasy stories, dragons are not just mindless beasts that do whatever they please.
Mm-hmm.
They have sentience. They have intelligence.
They can talk, even.
A lot of times they can talk. They're not mindless creatures, and so it makes me wonder if, like, there is, like, an inherited memory from, like, perhaps the dragons that we have are descendants or, like, manifestations of these gods in the world.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, personally, but it's definitely an interesting thought.
Right. I mean, it would be interesting because what marks the start of the Dragon Age is the return of dragons to Thedas.
Right.
And I think it'd be interesting. This is all fan theory and speculation on my part. We don't really know when Solus wakes up.
No, we don't know.
And so perhaps there's a connection between the return of dragons and Solus waking up.
If there's a connection with the Ebenuris.
Right. And, like, Solus says that he just woke up, but, like, what is time to a god?
What is just, Like...
Right.
Yeah,
like,
that's fair.
If Solus's claims are true, he's been alive for thousands of years. In that kind of time span, 100 years is what,
A drop in the bucket.
Yeah, like 0.5% of your time that you've been alive.
Right. It's a fair point.
So, like, that's my kind of, like, thing. Like, there's an interesting, like, it's drawing a connection between the Qunari and the elven gods that I want to know more about.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. I'm curious as well. Well, that's all I have about Viddasala.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have, unless you have some final thoughts about Par Vollen or Seheron or anything with the Qunari.
Nope.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. As always, you can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast. If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, email them to us at dalorecast@gmail.com. The Dragon Age Lorecast is a part of the Robots Radio Rocket Club,
You can join the Robots Radio Network Discord by clicking the link in our episode description. If you enjoyed our show, we'd love it if you'd subscribe and give us a review. See you next time.
Hi, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Ariel.
And we're the hosts of the Legend of Zelda Lorecast, podcast about all things Legend of Zelda, from Errol to Zora,
and all the fun things in between.
If you're ready to dive deep and learn more about the Legend of Zelda lore and everything surrounding it, come join us on the Legend of Zelda Lorecast. You can find us on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Google, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
We hope to see you soon.